Nintendo pulls back the curtain. You see a system that looks a lot like a Switch, but it's a Switch 2. Are you confused or do you get it? Because apparently the Switch 2 is confusing to a lot of potential buyers, and games that were supposed to be coming to Switch 2 aren't. A lot to dive into and discuss in today's Good Morning Mario and Good Morning Switch fans. Hope you're all doing it fantastic out there. The Switch 2 is confusing. I thought the Switch 2 was supposed to be obvious. That's why they put a gigantic 2 and the trailer showed the Switch transforming. We got to dig into this because what's happening to our world? What's going on, everybody? It's Zach from SwitchForce. Dr. Sir Cantoto, a notable video game industry analyst, has said that the Switch 2 is confusing. It's confusing, and Nintendo has made all efforts over the last 7 years to ensure that this wasn't confusing, so now I'm confused. But first, Nintendo stock prices reached their highest ever, which I think bodes very well for what stockholders believe the Switch 2 can do. But Sir Cantoto is worried that normies won't get what the Switch 2 can do, and I just want you to think about this, like, okay, obviously you and I, we know a lot about Nintendo. We know the Switch 2 is different than the Switch 1. We've been waiting for it for eons. We're ready. We've built up the hype, and here it is. If you were not a Nintendo fan, if you were not a YouTube gaming audience watcher, and you saw the Switch 2, would you think it's a different system? Now, this is like a legitimate question. I'm not trying to be funny here. Would you think it's a different system? And I like this picture right here. I think this picture is a great example. Is the Switch 2 a new, different system or not? Sit with it for a second. Okay, you have your answer. And now I'll read you Sir Cantoto's. He says, I can imagine normies being a bit confused. The device is bigger than the original Switch, but not comically large. The form factor, button layout, and overall design are very similar to Switch 1, so I can imagine issues arising when potential mainstream buyers look at the new device. And even the author of this article over at Games Radar, where Sir Cantoto spoke, says, even I, as someone whose job it is to care about the Switch 2, find myself observing it and saying, wow, that looks just like the Nintendo Switch. Okay, it does. But at the same time, how obvious do we need to be? If it was a triangle, is that what's going to work out? If it was a dodecahedron, is that what's going to convince people? So now it's not the name that's the issue, because before it was the name. When we went from Wii to Wii U, they said that's not a 2, that's a U. And Nintendo was like, what? And then everyone didn't get it, apparently. Or at least the average Walmart walk-in consumer. Now Nintendo has tried to really streamline this by naming it the Switch 2. It's straight up the Switch 2. Have you ever heard of the PS2, 3, 4, 5? The Switch 2 is the next one. It's not an iteration. It's not a half step. It's not a side step. It's not a special edition. It's not a big edition. It's the second one. It's the next one. It's the follow-up. And apparently this is confusing now because the form factor looks too similar. I don't know what you can do with a handheld hybrid console to make it look different. They went with a vibrant, bright scheme and then said dark mode. They said dark mode. And we'll give you the smallest paprika flake of color on the reverse side of the joysticks. And this apparently is still not enough to not be confusing. If you don't know what the Switch 2 is based on the name, based on the look, based on, I don't know what we can do for you. I don't know. How is the PS5 different than the PS4? Truly, how is it? Most of the games that came out on its initial release were on both. So how did someone know? I feel like this is silly. And one of two things is either mind-blowing. Either we're mind-blowingly undervaluing what the general consumer can figure out on their own, or the general consumer is mind-blowingly goofy and unawares and there's nothing we can do. Because the Wii U is confusing, the Switch 2 is not supposed to be, and now the Switch 2 is confusing. I don't think it's confusing. I think you see Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2, you can see there's an OLED, you can see there's a light, but to me, as soon as I see 2, like I see 2 of anything, right? I see Dune 2, I see Wicked Part 2, I see Avatar 2. I know that these are the next one and not an offshoot and not a side story and not a made-for-TV special. It's the next one. I think the 2 is all you need, but Sir Cantoto believes otherwise. Do you think the Switch 2 is going to confuse people and potentially rule out new buyers who don't think this looks like anything much different than the Switch 1, but bigger and darker? Now, I think there is a general argument to be made that games have had diminishing returns in terms of how they look substantially upgraded over their last-gen counterparts. That's something we've been dealing with for at least a generation or two now, where it's not like, oh, this guy used to have a blockhead, and now he's got a beautiful, suave, round face. Games have looked great for a while. Games look marginally greater most times, and in some cases, they look magically greater, but it is difficult to, parse, especially on the internet or on your phone, is this a PS5 game, a PS4 game, a PS6 game? What do we got going on here? And Nintendo Switch 2 will be no stranger to that, as not only will it have graphics that are between those two, but it will have games that come from all these different consoles, PS4, PS5, Switch 1, Switch 2. That, I get, is a bit overwhelming, but I think it's a simple matter of deduction. This is the world's easiest logic puzzle. Switch and Switch 2. Which one is new? Which one is different? I don't know. It feels absolutely insane to me to say that this is confusing, but alas, here we are. What was a bit confusing to some was that Xbox and Microsoft had a big presentation today, which frankly looked freaking sweet. If you're interested in any of these types of games, I absolutely recommend you check it out. All the games are pretty much coming everywhere, except Switch 2. Doom the Dark Ages, Expedition 33, we have a new Ninja Gaiden 4, and they're all announced for PC, Xbox, and PS5, with not a single darn mention of Switch. Now, this is a bit flummoxing, especially because Microsoft has pledged a lot of support to Switch, and many of the leaks highlight that Microsoft is actually making a ton of games for Switch 2. But I would not jump to conclusions. I would not worry here too much. First of all, there are two major factors that could make all of this make perfect sense. Number one, these games have all been in development for a while. Number one, these games are nearing the end of their development cycle and actually nearing their Gone Gold release cycle. We've got games coming out this year and in the next couple of months. In fact, the same month as some of Nintendo's big new presentations, meaning these games were probably not destined for Switch 2 from the beginning. I think when Nintendo obviously passed out dev kit consoles, some of these games were already into development and maybe they weren't meant for Switch 2 anyways. But there's also the thought that they just aren't meant for Switch 2 at the start and they could come to Switch 2 at a later date, which is something that we've heard from Nate the Hate is supposedly taking place with Assassin's Creed Shadows, that it won't be ready at launch, but it will be coming at a later date. And it's something that will eventually be ported to the Switch 2. And all of these games, I think, are perfectly potential Switch 2 games, but there's another point here that might even be more a reason why you didn't see a Switch 2 logo. Nintendo controls the messaging. Nintendo controls the airplane, basically. There are no co-pilots because Nintendo is flying this Switch 2 plane, and they've established that by how they revealed the console. They didn't give you a release date. They didn't give you a price. They didn't give you a named game. They gave you the hardware. And then they said, check back in a few months. Nintendo is riding this exactly how they've laid the track, and it might not be time for them to announce major partnerships. Now, obviously, we're getting some Switch 2 games announced, but many of those are from much smaller developers and publishers. The big partnerships are going to be inevitably saved for Nintendo to speak on them. And Nintendo hasn't even revealed their own software, let alone give us a glimpse into what these third parties have planned. So outside of leaks, you probably aren't going to hear a ton from the Microsofts, the EAs, and the Capcoms of the world until that April 2nd presentation. Perhaps there is some pre-negotiated deal where a company can speak out before Nintendo chooses to do so, but let's just say Doom the Dark Ages was going to come to Nintendo Switch 2. And it could, right? Let's say it does come to Switch 2. Is that going to be announced at the Xbox Developer Direct? Or is that going to be announced at the Nintendo Direct? Yes, the answer is obviously the latter. Those of you who pressed Nintendo Direct win a cookie. And here we are, as Nintendo likes to drive this conversation. Look how they've utilized their directs, their partner showcases, and their announcements in the past. They love to be the ones to say, this game is coming to Switch. And as the Switch 2 is going to, I think, capitalize on third parties much more, early on, Nintendo's going to want to take absolute charge of that narrative. They're going to want to show, hey, Look at these brilliant partners we have. Look at these amazing franchises coming to our system. And look how this is complemented by our great games too. Nobody's going to go out ahead of Nintendo and say the first big Switch 2 games are Doom the Dark Ages, Expedition 33, and Ninja Gaiden 4, before we even know if Mario Kart is a 9 or an X, and before we even know if 3D Mario is going back to the Land of Odyssey or to a brand new world altogether. Nintendo will set this course, and Nintendo will speak first. So I wouldn't worry about these games. There's no guarantee that Doom the Dark Ages is or isn't on Switch 2, and the same can be said for every other title today. But if they were going to be on Switch 2, now is not the place where they would reveal it. I think many were hoping that the floodgates would absolutely open with game reveals, and I think we're going to see that from the indie space, like the eShop space, the smaller single-A and double-A space. But when it comes to AAA titles, we've got to wait for that April 2nd Direct before we can expect these big publishers to speak about their coming Switch lineups. I think we'll get a lot of leaks, and I think those leaks will be pretty trustworthy, but I think just when it comes to how this has to be structured and scheduled, Nintendo's got to speak first, and these games, even if they're announced, discussed, shown off, revealed, released before the Switch 2 Direct in April, you're not going to see a Switch 2 logo. But I don't think that means that we're locked out of all these games, or the Switch 2 is actually going to have nothing, or the Switch 2 is not getting the games it was supposed to. There will inevitably be videos made and articles written about how the Switch 2 is not able to handle these games. It's not getting the games we expected it to get. These games are releasing and they're not showing up on Switch 2. There's not even an indication. And then April 2nd will roll around, and then June will roll around, and many of these games will be confirmed, released, and shown in their Switch 2 form factor. I would not worry about any major game. I think there's a lot on the table, and if you believe the leaks that Microsoft is really just like absolutely printing titles for Switch 2, then some, many, or all of these games shown today may end up there even later this year. So confusion in the air, but I think all is well. I don't think the Switch 2 is confusing. I think the games lineup is going to be absolutely huge, and we're all in for a good time. We just got to wait till April. Nintendo will speak first because they're Nintendo, and like I said, they're flying the plane. We're just riding along with them. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Hope you've enjoyed today's ride and video. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, stay positive out there. Love you lots. SwitchForce out.